The Tonight Show was in full swing on a crisp Thursday evening in October, and Studio 6B pulsed with the kind of energy that made live television magical. Jimmy Fallon bounced between segments with his trademark enthusiasm. The audience was laughing at all the right moments, and the Roots provided their signature warmth that turned every taping into a celebration. But sometimes the most profound moments happen when celebration meets sorrow, when joy encounters loss, and when a simple dance becomes something sacred. The wedding dance segment had become one of Jimmy's favorite recurring bits. Couples from the audience would volunteer to showcase their wedding dances, from the elegant to the embarrassing, while the Roots provided live musical accompaniment. It was always good for laughs, sometimes surprisingly touching, and tonight felt like it would follow the same delightful pattern. The studio glowed in its familiar blue and gold palette, the New York skyline sparkling through the windows like scattered diamonds. 243 people filled the seats, their faces bright with anticipation. The segment had already featured two couples, newlyweds from Chicago, who had practiced an elaborate swing routine, and a couple celebrating their 25th anniversary, who admitted they still stepped on each other's feet, but loved dancing anyway. All right, Jimmy called out to the audience, his voice carrying that infectious energy that had made him America's favorite late-night host. Do we have one more couple who wants to show us their moves? Come on, don't be shy. Love is in the air tonight. Hands shot up around the studio. Couples whispered to each other, some giggling, others looking nervous but excited. Jimmy scanned the crowd with practiced eyes, looking for that perfect combination of enthusiasm and entertainment value that made for great television. That's when he saw her. In the 7th row, slightly off to the left, an elderly woman had raised her hand, but something about the gesture was different from the eager volunteers around her. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of what she was about to do required enormous effort. She appeared to be in her late 70s, with silver hair styled in the careful way of someone who still believed in dressing up for special occasions. She wore a navy blue dress with small pearl earrings, and in her lap Jimmy could just make out what looked like a small photograph. "Yes, ma'am," Jimmy called out, pointing toward her with a smile. "Do you and your husband want to show us your wedding dance?" The woman stood up slowly, her movements careful but determined. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the studio, touched with just the hint of an accent that suggested the American South. "Well, Mr. Jimmy," she began, and something about the way she addressed him, formal but warm, like he was a grandson who'd come to visit, made the entire studio lean forward slightly. "I don't have a husband to dance with tonight," she continued, her voice steady despite what Jimmy was beginning to recognize as profound sadness. "But I have been waiting 50 years to have my wedding dance." The laughter in the studio didn't die immediately. Some audience members weren't sure they'd heard correctly. But Jimmy felt something shift in his chest, that familiar tingle that told him they were about to step into territory far deeper than entertainment. 50 years? Jimmy repeated gently, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. "Can you tell us more about that?" The woman nodded, reaching into her purse with hands that trembled slightly. She pulled out a black and white photograph, holding it up so Jimmy could see. Even from the stage, he could make out the image of a young couple, a beautiful girl in a simple white dress standing beside a handsome young man in what looked like a military uniform. "This is Thomas," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke his name. "Thomas Michael Sullivan. We were supposed to be married on June 15th, 1973. I had my dress, we had our venue, and we had picked out our first dance song." She paused, looking down at the photograph with infinite tenderness. "But 3 weeks before our wedding, his unit was deployed to Vietnam." The studio fell completely silent now. Even the Roots had stopped their subtle background playing, Questlove's hands frozen above his drums. This wasn't a funny wedding dance story anymore. This was something else entirely. "He promised me," the woman continued, and now her voice carried the weight of 5 decades of waiting, "that when he came home, we would have the most beautiful wedding dance anyone had ever seen. He said he was going to practice with his buddies overseas so he could sweep me off my feet." Jimmy found himself walking down from the stage without conscious decision, drawn by the gravity of this woman's story. "What happened?" he asked softly. "He never came home," she replied simply. "Thomas was killed in action on May 23rd, 1973, 3 weeks before our wedding day, 3 weeks before I could become Mrs. Sullivan." The silence that followed was unlike anything Studio 6B had ever experienced. It wasn't the dramatic pause of television or the comedic timing of a punchline. It was the silence of recognition, of an entire room full of people suddenly understanding that they were in the presence of a love story that had been interrupted by history. Jimmy reached the woman's row and she stood to meet him. Up close, he could see that she was still beautiful, her eyes bright blue and alert, carrying the kind of strength that comes from surviving the unthinkable. She wore the photograph on a small chain around her neck, close to her heart. "What's your name?" Jimmy asked gently. "Dorothy," she replied. "Dorothy Mae Henderson. I never did become Dorothy Sullivan, though. I've been waiting for that dance for 50 years. Jimmy felt something break open in his chest. This wasn't about comedy anymore, wasn't about entertainment or viral moments or keeping the energy high. This was about a woman who had carried a broken heart for 5 decades, who had come to a television studio to honor a promise that would never be fulfilled in the way it was meant to be. "Dorothy," Jimmy said, and his voice was completely different now. Not the polished, energetic voice of a talk show host, but the warm, human voice of someone who understood that some moments are too sacred for performance. "What was your song?" Dorothy's eyes brightened, and for a moment Jimmy could see the young woman she had been, the bride who never got to walk down the aisle. "It was The Way You Look Tonight," she said. "Thomas said it was perfect, because that's how he wanted to remember me forever, beautiful and young and happy." Jimmy turned toward the Roots, and Questlove nodded before he even asked the question. Of course they knew the song. Of course they would play it. The Roots weren't just a house band. They were musicians who understood that some moments require perfect accompaniment. "Dorothy," Jimmy said, extending his hand toward her, "would you do me the honor of having that dance tonight?" The tears that had been threatening finally spilled down Dorothy's cheeks, but she was smiling through them. "You would do that?" she whispered. "It would be my privilege," Jimmy replied, and he meant it completely. Dorothy took his hand, and together they moved to the small space in front of the stage that served as a dance floor for the segment. But this wasn't a segment anymore. This was something else entirely. This was a sacred moment, witnessed by millions, where love transcended time and loss and the impossible distance between what was and what should have been. The Roots began to play The Way You Look Tonight, with a gentleness that transformed the studio into something resembling a chapel. The lighting director, without being asked, dimmed the harsh studio lights and bathed the dance floor in a soft golden glow that made Dorothy look exactly like what she was, a bride, 50 years late, finally having her moment. Jimmy placed one hand on Dorothy's waist and took her hand with the other, just as he'd done at his own wedding, just as Thomas would have done in 1973. Dorothy moved with the practiced grace of someone who had imagined this moment countless times, who had danced with shadows and memories in her living room for 50 years. "He's here, isn't he?" Jimmy whispered as they swayed to the music. Dorothy nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I can feel him," she said. "I can feel his hands instead of yours. I can hear him humming along just like he used to." Around them, the studio had transformed into something magical. The audience wasn't watching entertainment. They were witnessing love. Real love. The kind that doesn't die when the body does. The kind that waits patiently for 50 years for its moment to shine. As they danced, Dorothy began to speak, her voice barely audible to anyone but Jimmy. "I never married," she said. "I tried to love other people, but my heart belonged to Thomas. People said I was foolish, that I was wasting my life on a ghost. But love isn't wasteful, is it? Love is the only thing that lasts." Jimmy felt his own tears start then, thinking about his wife, his daughters, the way love had shaped every good thing in his life. "No," he agreed softly. "Love isn't wasteful at all." "I used to dance with his photograph," Dorothy continued. "Every year on what would have been our anniversary, I would put on my wedding dress. It still fits, you know, and I would dance with his memory. But I always dreamed of having a real partner, someone who could help me feel what it would have been like." The song was reaching its crescendo, and Jimmy could see that Dorothy was lost in the moment, transported back to 1973, dancing with the man she was supposed to marry. Her eyes were closed, and she was smiling with the kind of pure joy that comes from a dream finally being fulfilled. "Thomas," she whispered so quietly that only Jimmy could hear, "we finally got our dance." As the music began to fade, Jimmy didn't let go immediately. Instead, he held Dorothy close, letting her have this moment for as long as she needed it. The studio remained silent, understanding instinctively that applause would break something sacred. When the song finally ended, Dorothy opened her eyes and looked up at Jimmy with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply. "You gave me my wedding dance." Jimmy helped Dorothy back to her seat, but the moment wasn't over. Something had shifted in Studio 6B, something that transcended entertainment and touched the very heart of what it means to be human. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the cameras, "sometimes the most beautiful dances are the ones that come 50 years late. Sometimes love finds a way to keep its promises, even when life has other plans." He turned back to Dorothy, who was carefully tucking Thomas's photograph back against her heart. "Dorothy, you have shown us something tonight that I think everyone needs to remember. That love doesn't end with death. That promises matter even when they seem impossible to keep. That it's never too late to honor what we've lost by celebrating what remains." The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything Studio 6B had ever experienced. It started with one person, then two, then the entire audience rising as one to honor this woman who had waited 50 years for a dance and had finally gotten it from the most unlikely partner. But Jimmy wasn't finished. In that moment, he made a decision that would define not just this episode, but his entire understanding of what television could be at its very best. "Dorothy," he said, walking back to her seat, "I want to do something for you and for Thomas." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "I want everyone watching to know about Thomas Michael Sullivan. I want them to know that he was brave, that he was loved, and that his memory has been kept alive by an extraordinary one for 50 years." Jimmy looked directly into the camera. "If you're watching this and you have a love story that was interrupted by war, by illness, by circumstances beyond your control, I want you to know that your story matters too. Love that endures deserves to be celebrated, even when, especially when, it comes with loss." He turned back to Dorothy one more time. "And Dorothy, I want you to know that tonight wasn't just a dance. Tonight was a wedding reception, 50 years in the making. Tonight, in front of millions of people, you finally became the bride you were always meant to be." Dorothy stood up again, And this time, she wasn't crying. She was radiant, glowing with the kind of joy that comes from carrying a burden for so long that you forget how heavy it was until someone helps you set it down. "Thank you, Jimmy," she said, "and thank you, Thomas. Wherever you are, we finally got our dance." The episode that aired 3 weeks later became the most watched Tonight Show episode in the show's history. The video of Dorothy and Jimmy's dance was shared millions of times across social media, with viewers from around the world sharing their own stories of love, loss, and the promises we keep to those we've lost. But more than that, the episode sparked something beautiful. Veterans organizations reached out to Dorothy, wanting to honor Thomas's memory. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund created a special exhibit featuring love stories like Dorothy and Thomas's. Other women who had lost fiancés in various conflicts connected with Dorothy, forming a sisterhood of love that transcended geography and time. Dorothy returned to The Tonight Show 6 months later, not as an audience member, but as Jimmy's special guest. She brought with her something that brought the studio to tears again: Thomas's actual dress uniform, carefully preserved for 50 years, and his Purple Heart, awarded posthumously for his sacrifice. "I wanted to share these with you," she told Jimmy, "boy, do you warm, because that dance we had wasn't just ours. It belonged to Thomas, too, and to every love story that never got its proper ending." Jimmy established the Dorothy and Thomas dance as an annual Tonight Show tradition. Every June 15th, what would have been their wedding anniversary, the show features couples who have kept love alive despite loss, who have honored promises that seemed impossible to keep. And Dorothy? She finally did wear her wedding dress one more time. At the age of 78, she married Henry, a widower she met through the veterans support group that formed around her story. Their first dance at their wedding reception was, naturally, "The Way You Look Tonight." But she still wears Thomas's photograph on the chain around her neck. And at her new wedding, there was a special candle lit in his honor. Because real love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies. The dance floor in Studio 6B now has a small plaque that reads, "In memory of all the dances that were delayed but not denied, love finds a way." It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful television happens when entertainment steps aside and makes room for humanity. Jimmy still thinks about Dorothy and Thomas every time he dances with his own wife. He thinks about the fragility of love, the preciousness of time, and the courage it takes to keep faith with someone who can only live on in memory and music, and the promise of a dance that finally, after 50 years of waiting, found its moment to shine. Because that's what love looks like under television studio lights. That's what healing sounds like when it's set to music and witnessed by millions. And that's what happens when a simple dance becomes a bridge between heartbreak and hope, between loss and celebration, between what was lost and what can still be found. It wasn't just late-night television. It was a reminder that love stories don't end with death. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right partner to help them reach their beautiful conclusion.